April 28, 1945. Lechfeld Airbase, Bavaria, Germany. The Third Reich is collapsing. Soviet armies are entering Berlin. American forces are sweeping across southern Germany. At Lechfeld, one of the Luftwaffe's most important airbases, Oberst Friedrich Kessler faces an impossible situation. His base houses 200-plus aircraft, Me-262 jets, FW-190 fighters, experimental prototypes. He commands 3,000 personnel. Berlin has ordered him to destroy everything and fight to the death. Kessler knows this is insane. The war is lost. Destroying the base and killing his men serves no purpose except Hitler's mad desire to take Germany down with him. But disobeying means execution for treason. So Kessler makes an extraordinary decision. Instead of surrendering to approaching American military forces, which would be conventional but still technically treason under Nazi law, he decides to surrender to someone with no military authority whatsoever, an American journalist. Lee Miller, a Vogue photographer and war correspondent, has been following the U.S. Army advance through Bavaria. She's documenting the collapse of Nazi Germany for American audiences. She's fearless, talented, and has absolutely no authority to accept military surrenders. Kessler doesn't care. His logic: if he surrenders to a civilian journalist rather than military forces, perhaps he can claim he was captured, not that he voluntarily surrendered. It's a legal fiction, but it might save his life. This is the story of the strangest surrender of World War II. Friedrich Kessler was not a typical Nazi officer. Born in 1898, he served in World War I as a fighter pilot, earning the Iron Cross. Between the wars, he flew civilian aircraft and taught at flight schools. When the Luftwaffe reformed in 1935, Kessler rejoined, not from Nazi ideology but from love of aviation. By 1945, he's 47 years old, ancient by fighter pilot standards, and commands Lechfeld Air Base not because of his political loyalty but because of his administrative competence. He's a skilled organizer who kept the base functional despite Allied bombing and resource shortages. Kessler is no Nazi true believer. He joined the party in 1937 because career advancement required it, not from conviction. He's watched with growing horror as Germany commits atrocities, starts losing the war, and descends into Hitler's apocalyptic madness. By April 1945, Kessler knows Germany has lost. He knows the war is over. He knows further resistance is pointless murder. But he also knows that openly advocating surrender means execution. Throughout April, he receives increasingly insane orders from Berlin: destroy all aircraft before they fall into enemy hands. Fight to the last man. Death before dishonor. Kessler ignores them when possible, claiming communication difficulties. But as American forces approach, he can't delay anymore. He must either follow orders, destroying billions of Reichsmarks worth of aircraft and killing thousands of his men in pointless last stands, or find another way. Lee Miller was already famous before she became a war correspondent. A stunning beauty who modeled for Vogue in the 1920s, she became a surrealist photographer in Paris, friends with Picasso and Man Ray. When war broke out, she talked her way into becoming a war correspondent for Vogue, unusual for a fashion magazine, but Miller was unusual herself. By April 1945, she's photographed the London Blitz, the Normandy invasion, the liberation of Paris, and the horrors of Buchenwald and Dachau concentration camps. She's seen the worst of Nazi Germany and documented it unflinchingly. Miller is following the U.S. 7th Army as it advances through Bavaria. She's looking for stories, human stories amid the collapse of the Third Reich. On April 28, she's near Landsberg, photographing the chaos of Germany's final days: refugees fleeing, Nazi officials burning documents, German soldiers deserting. Her driver, a U.S. Army corporal assigned to transport her, suggests they investigate smoke rising from Lechfeld Air Base, 30 kilometers away. Miller agrees, expecting to photograph a bombed airfield or perhaps fleeing Luftwaffe personnel. She has no idea she's about to accept the surrender of an entire German airbase, something no journalist has ever done or ever will do again. April 28, 1945, 2 p.m. Miller and her driver approach Lechfeld Airbase in a jeep marked with press credentials. They're technically behind enemy lines, no American combat forces have reached this area yet. It's absurdly dangerous. As they near the base perimeter, they expect to be fired upon or turned away. Instead, German guards at the gate wave them through. No shots. No challenges. The guards seem relieved. Miller and the corporal exchange confused glances but drive onto the base. What they see is surreal, hundreds of aircraft parked in neat rows, completely undamaged. Ground crews working on planes as if the war isn't ending. Personnel going about normal duties. No panic. No destruction. No chaos. It's like driving onto an active military base during peacetime, except everyone's wearing Luftwaffe uniforms and the aircraft are German fighters and jets. They're directed to the base headquarters. Miller grabs her camera. Whatever's happening, it's going to be an incredible story. At headquarters, an officer in an immaculate Luftwaffe uniform greets them formally, Oberst Friedrich Kessler, base commander. He speaks excellent English, learned from his pre-war civilian flying days. "Miss Miller," he says. "I've been waiting for you. Or rather, waiting for someone like you. I wish to surrender this airbase to avoid unnecessary destruction. Will you accept?" Miller stares at Kessler, certain she's misunderstood. He's offering to surrender an entire Luftwaffe airbase to her, a photographer for a fashion magazine. Kessler explains his reasoning, speaking calmly and precisely, the war is over. Germany has lost. Berlin will fall within days, if it hasn't already. Further resistance serves no purpose except to kill my men and destroy valuable aircraft for no strategic gain. I have orders to destroy everything and fight to the last man. These orders are insane. I will not follow them. However, if I formally surrender to American military forces, I can be court-martialed and executed for treason under Nazi military law. My family in Munich could face retaliation. But if I am captured by a civilian, if American forces find this base already in civilian hands, then perhaps I can claim I had no choice. It's a legal fiction, but it might save lives. You're a journalist. You have no military authority. Perfect. You can't formally accept a military surrender. But you can be present when I order my men to stand down and declare this base under American protection. Will you help me avoid pointless bloodshed, Miss Miller? Miller's mind races. This is completely outside any protocol or authority she has. But Kessler is right, the alternative is destruction and death for no purpose. She makes a decision that will be debated by military historians forever. Yes, Oberst. I'll accept your surrender. What happens next is perhaps the most surreal military ceremony of World War II. Kessler assembles his senior officers in the base headquarters. Miller and her driver are the only Allied personnel present, one journalist and one army corporal who's completely out of his depth. Kessler announces to his officers, "Gentlemen, the war is effectively over. American forces will be here within hours. I have decided to surrender this base to prevent unnecessary destruction and loss of life." "Oberst Kessler, this is treason," one officer shouts. "Call it what you wish," Kessler replies calmly. "But consider the alternative. We can destroy 200 aircraft and kill ourselves in a final battle, or we can preserve these aircraft and our lives. History will judge which choice was correct." Several officers protest. A few support him. Most are simply relieved someone made the decision for them. Kessler then does something extraordinary, he conducts a formal surrender ceremony with Miller as the recipient. He presents her with his sidearm, a Luger pistol. He signs a document declaring the base under American protection. He orders guards to stand down and all aircraft to remain intact. Miller photographs everything, her camera clicking through what will become some of the most unusual images of the war's end, a German colonel surrendering to a fashion photographer while his officers watch in bewildered silence. In the hours after the surrender, as they wait for actual American military forces to arrive, Kessler explains his reasoning to Miller in detail. His explanation reveals a complex man trying to navigate an impossible moral situation. Miss Miller, I am not a hero. I'm not even particularly brave. I'm a career officer who loves flying and wanted nothing to do with Hitler's madness. But I joined the Luftwaffe, I wore the uniform, I followed orders. I'm complicit in everything Germany did, whether I believed in it or not. I cannot undo that complicity. But I can prevent one final atrocity, the senseless destruction of this base and the deaths of these men in a war that's already lost. If I surrender to American forces normally, Nazi loyalists among my officers might resist or sabotage the surrender. Some might try to carry out Berlin's orders to destroy everything. People would die. But surrendering to a civilian journalist? It's so absurd, so unprecedented, that it creates confusion. In that confusion, resistance becomes pointless. How do you resist a surrender that's already technically invalid? I'm not trying to escape justice, Miss Miller. I know I'll face Allied courts for my role in this war. I deserve that. But I don't deserve execution by my own side for refusing to commit final pointless murders. His logic is twisted but sound. And as Miller documents everything with her camera, she realizes she's witnessing something unprecedented, a man using bureaucratic absurdity as a weapon against fanaticism. What Kessler surrendered to Miller was extraordinary, one of the most valuable collections of Luftwaffe aircraft remaining intact in Germany. The inventory Miller documented with her camera, 47 Mi-262 jet fighters, the world's first operational jet fighter, revolutionary and deadly. 89 FW-190 fighters, among Germany's finest piston-engine fighters. 34 Bf-109 fighters, the legendary Luftwaffe workhorse. 12 Ju-88 bombers. 8 experimental aircraft including prototype jets and rocket-powered designs. Dozens of trainers, transports, and reconnaissance aircraft. Total, over 200 aircraft in varying states of operation, plus parts, equipment, and technical documents. The value was incalculable, both militarily and historically. If Kessler had followed orders to destroy everything, these aircraft would be lost forever. Instead, they fell into American hands intact, providing intelligence on German aviation technology that would influence post-war aircraft development. Several Mi-262 jets were flown to the United States for testing, directly influencing American jet fighter design. Technical documents were studied extensively, advancing American understanding of swept-wing aerodynamics and jet propulsion. Some aircraft were preserved in museums, where they remain today as historical artifacts. Kessler's decision to preserve rather than destroy this collection was not motivated by concern for aviation history, he was trying to save his own life and his men's lives. But the historical consequence was preservation of irreplaceable examples of late-war German aviation technology. Around 6 p.m. on April 28, elements of the U.S. 7th Army reached Lechfeld. They expected to find either a destroyed airbase or a final desperate battle. Instead, they found Lee Miller standing at the gate with a camera, a Luger pistol, and a signed surrender document from a German Oberst. The American officers' reactions ranged from confusion to fury to amusement. Captain James Wilson, first American officer on scene, later described it, "I thought it was a joke. This woman from Vogue magazine tells me she's accepted the surrender of a German airbase. I asked if she'd lost her mind. She hands me a Luger and a surrender document signed by the base commander. Then she shows me 200 intact German aircraft. At that point, I stopped asking questions and called for my colonel. Colonel Robert Crawford arrived with a battalion. His reaction was more pragmatic, I don't care how or why they surrendered. The base is intact, the aircraft are intact, and 3,000 German personnel have laid down arms without a fight. That's a success by any measure. We can sort out the irregularities later." Military intelligence officers descended on the base within hours, beginning the assessment of captured aircraft and documents. Kessler was taken into custody, not as a prisoner of war but as a special detainee pending investigation. The legal situation was unprecedented. Had Kessler surrendered? Had he been captured? Could Miller, a civilian, legally accept a military surrender? Did it even matter since American forces now controlled the base? In the weeks after the surrender, U.S. military intelligence investigated Kessler and the circumstances of Lechfeld's surrender. What they discovered complicated any simple narrative. Kessler had been ignoring Berlin's increasingly insane orders for weeks. He'd claimed radio malfunctions, communication failures, and delays to avoid executing destruction orders. He'd been in secret communication with anti-Nazi officers in other Luftwaffe units, coordinating potential mass surrenders. Several of these officers were arrested and executed by SS units in the war's final days. He'd deliberately slowed the evacuation of valuable personnel and equipment, keeping everything at Lechfeld where it could be surrendered intact rather than dispersed or destroyed. He'd provided subtle assistance to American POWs held at the base, ensuring they were treated well and protected as American forces approached. He'd falsified records to hide Jewish ancestry of several Luftwaffe personnel under his command, saving them from SS roundups. The picture that emerged was of a man who'd been quietly sabotaging Nazi orders for months while maintaining enough compliance to avoid detection and execution. The surrender to Miller was simply the culmination of his long-running quiet rebellion. But it also complicated his legal status. Was he a war criminal who'd followed orders for years before a convenient last-minute defection? Or was he a resistor who'd risked his life to undermine the Nazi regime from within? The truth, as usual, was somewhere between. Lee Miller's photographs and writings about the Lechfeld surrender became one of the most unusual stories of the war's end. Her Vogue article, published in June 1945, was titled "The Colonel Who Surrendered to Vogue." It included photographs of Kessler formally presenting his Luger. Rows of intact Mi-262 jets. German ground crews standing at attention as American forces arrived. The signed surrender document. Her own reflection in the mirror of Hitler's abandoned Munich apartment, she'd visited it the same week, another surreal moment. The article was both serious and absurd, capturing the strangeness of Germany's collapse. "I accepted the surrender of a German airbase today," she wrote. "I have no authority to do this. I'm not a general or a diplomat. I write about fashion and photograph artwork. But in the insane final days of Hitler's Reich, nothing makes sense anymore. So why shouldn't a fashion photographer accept the surrender of 3,000 German soldiers and 200 aircraft? It's no more absurd than anything else happening in this dying nightmare of a country." Her photographs became iconic images of the war's end, particularly the shots of pristine German jets lined up as if on display, with American soldiers examining them in wonder. But she also wrote seriously about Kessler's dilemma: he's not a hero. He's a man who wore the uniform of an evil regime and followed orders for years. But at the end, he chose to save lives rather than destroy them. Is that redemption? I don't know. But it's better than the alternative. Friedrich Kessler's fate after the surrender was complicated and, in some ways, fortunate. He was not charged with war crimes. Investigation revealed no evidence of atrocities under his command. He'd run an airbase, not a concentration camp. His record was clean apart from general complicity in serving the Nazi regime. However, he was detained for 2 years as a witness and source of intelligence. American interrogators were interested in his knowledge of Luftwaffe operations, aircraft technology, and Nazi command structure. He cooperated fully, providing detailed information about German aviation developments, including experimental projects. In 1947, he was released under denazification proceedings. His verdict: Mitläufer, follower. Someone who joined the Nazi Party and served the regime but wasn't an active participant in crimes. His punishment: loss of pension rights from his Luftwaffe service and prohibition from holding public office. He returned to civilian life, working as a flight instructor at a small airfield near Munich, the same job he'd done before Hitler. He never spoke publicly about the surrender to Lee Miller, except once in a 1963 interview with a German aviation magazine. Asked about it, he said, "I'm not proud of waiting until the last moment to do the right thing. I should have resisted sooner. But I'm also not ashamed of preventing pointless deaths in a war that was already lost. If I had to do it again, I would. Even if it meant surrendering to a photographer from a fashion magazine." Historians remain divided about how to assess Kessler's actions. One interpretation: Kessler was a hero. He risked execution to save lives and preserve historical artifacts. His method was unorthodox but effective. He should be honored for moral courage in an impossible situation. The opposing interpretation: Kessler was an opportunist. He served the Nazi regime loyally for years, then conveniently switched sides when defeat was certain. The surrender to Miller was a calculated attempt to avoid punishment by creating legal confusion about whether he'd actually surrendered or been captured. The surrender was self-serving, not altruistic. The truth, as historians who've studied the case acknowledge, is probably both. Dr. Wilhelm Hoffmann, who wrote a 2003 book about Lechfeld's surrender, concluded, Kessler was no resistance hero. He served the Luftwaffe faithfully until it became clear Germany would lose. But he also wasn't a fanatic willing to die for a lost cause. In April 1945, when presented with the choice between mass destruction or mass preservation, he chose preservation. That's not heroism, it's basic humanity. But in the context of Nazi Germany's apocalyptic final weeks, basic humanity was itself an act of resistance. The debate continues, complicated by the fact that Kessler's motivations were likely mixed: self-preservation, genuine desire to save his men's lives, love of aviation, and perhaps a moral awakening about the regime he'd served. The surrender of Lechfeld to Lee Miller had consequences beyond the immediate preservation of aircraft. It demonstrated that not all German officers were fanatical Nazis willing to follow suicidal orders. This complicated post-war narratives about German guilt and responsibility. It provided American intelligence with intact examples of late-war Luftwaffe technology, accelerating American jet aircraft development. It created a legal precedent, however unusual, for surrenders to non-military personnel in situations where formal military surrender would endanger lives. It produced one of the most unusual photo essays of the war's end, preserving a moment when the absurdity of Nazi Germany's collapse was perfectly encapsulated. It complicated denazification proceedings. How do you judge an officer who served the regime but saved lives at the end? The Lechfeld precedent influenced how thousands of similar cases were handled. For Lee Miller personally, it was one of many extraordinary experiences during her war correspondence, but perhaps the most surreal. She photographed the liberation of Buchenwald and Dachau, she bathed in Hitler's bathtub, she documented the fall of Nazi Germany, and she accepted the surrender of an airbase. In her later life, suffering from PTSD from what she'd witnessed during the war, she rarely spoke about Lechfeld. When she did, she said, "I was a photographer who happened to be there when a German officer wanted to stop killing. I said yes. Anyone would have done the same." The story of Lechfeld's surrender remains one of the most unusual episodes of World War II's end. It shouldn't have happened. Military surrenders don't go to civilian journalists. Base commanders don't ignore orders and independently decide to end their participation in wars. Fashion photographers don't accept Luger pistols from German colonels. But in the chaos of Nazi Germany's collapse in April 1945, normal rules didn't apply. Friedrich Kessler faced an impossible choice: follow insane orders that served no military purpose, or find some way to preserve lives and resources. He chose an absurd solution: surrender to someone with no authority to accept his surrender, creating legal confusion that might save him from charges of treason. Lee Miller faced an unexpected opportunity: document an unprecedented moment and possibly save lives by accepting a surrender she had no authority to accept. She said yes because the alternative, destruction and death, was worse. The result: 200 aircraft preserved for history and intelligence analysis. 3,000 German personnel survived the war. One of the most unusual photo essays ever published in Vogue. An illegal/historical oddity that defies neat categorization. Was Kessler a hero or a coward? Was Miller a participant in history or just a lucky observer? Was the surrender legitimate or a face-saving fiction? The answers don't matter as much as the outcome. On April 28, 1945, at Lechfeld Air Base, two people, a German officer and an American photographer, chose humanity over protocol. In the apocalyptic final days of the Third Reich, that choice was revolutionary. And it resulted in the only time in history an entire military base surrendered to a fashion magazine photographer.